The easiest signature to write is often the hardest one to live with. Ryan Whitaker did not hesitate as he lowered the fountain pen onto the final page of the divorce agreement. The black ink flowed smoothly across the paper, completing a decision he had convinced himself was overdue. Across the polished oak conference table, Vanessa Brooks remained remarkably composed. She did not interrupt him. She did not ask for another chance. She simply watched the attorney organize the documents with the same quiet expression she had carried into the downtown Manhattan law office nearly an hour earlier. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, late afternoon sunlight reflected from neighboring skyscrapers, bathing the conference room in warm shades of gold that seemed strangely out of place for the end of a marriage. Daniel Hayes, Ryan's longtime attorney, gathered the signed paperwork into a leather folder before sliding the final copies toward both clients. "Once these documents are filed this afternoon," he explained calmly, "the agreement will become official according to the terms both of you accepted." Ryan gave a brief nod without looking up. He had another board meeting scheduled in less than 45 minutes, followed by dinner, with international investors arriving from San Francisco. His calendar was full. His company continued expanding. His future appeared perfectly organized. Divorce, he believed, was simply one more difficult task that responsible adults completed before moving on with their lives. Vanessa slowly placed her copy inside a simple canvas portfolio, stood from her chair, and thanked the attorney with genuine courtesy. Then, just before reaching the conference room door, she paused. Without saying a word, she removed a plain white envelope from her portfolio and placed it gently on the center of the conference table. There was no dramatic gesture, no trembling hands, no tears. Only one handwritten sentence appeared across the front in neat blue ink. "For Ryan, please open after everything is finalized." Ryan glanced at the envelope before giving a faint, almost amused smile. "A farewell letter?" he asked lightly. Vanessa looked at him for a quiet moment. "No," she answered. "It is simply something I believe belongs to you now." Her voice carried neither resentment nor hope. It sounded like someone returning an item that had never truly belonged to her. Before Ryan could ask another question, she wished everyone in the room well and walked away. The soft click of the closing door echoed through the conference room with surprising finality. Ryan leaned back in his chair and looked toward Daniel. "You know," he said with a short laugh, "I was expecting anger, maybe accusations. Instead, I get an envelope." Daniel studied the sealed paper for several seconds before replying. "Some people say everything they need to say before they ever speak out loud." Ryan shrugged, slipped the envelope into his briefcase without opening it, and stood. "Whatever is inside can wait. I have more important things to deal with today." Less than an hour later, the court filing was officially completed. Ryan's phone vibrated with confirmation from Daniel that every legal requirement had been finalized. Standing alone inside the executive elevator of Whitaker Medical Technologies, Ryan remembered the envelope resting inside his briefcase. The building's quiet mechanical hum surrounded him as he reached down, broke the seal with his thumb, and unfolded the first page. Before he finished reading the opening paragraph, the confident expression that had remained on his face all afternoon slowly disappeared. Ryan Whitaker remained motionless inside the executive elevator as the first page rested in his hands. The opening lines were not emotional, dramatic, or written to provoke guilt. They were calm, almost clinical. "Dear Ryan, if you are reading this, our divorce is already final, which means neither of us owes the other another argument. I promised myself this letter would never become a plea to change your mind, because love that must be negotiated has already disappeared. Instead, I want to give you something much simpler. I want to give you the truth I never found the right moment to tell you." Before he could continue, the elevator doors opened onto the executive floor. His assistant greeted him with the day's agenda, but Ryan quietly folded the letter and slipped it back into the envelope. "Cancel my last meeting," he said unexpectedly. "Reschedule it for tomorrow." The assistant looked surprised. During 8 years of working together, Ryan had almost never canceled an appointment without extraordinary circumstances. "Is everything all right?" she asked carefully. Ryan nodded automatically, although he was no longer certain that was true. 40 minutes later, he sat alone inside his corner office, overlooking Midtown Manhattan. The city stretched endlessly beyond the glass walls, alive with traffic, construction cranes, and thousands of people chasing ambitions that suddenly felt strangely distant. He unfolded the second page. Instead of accusations, Vanessa had written about ordinary moments. The first apartment they rented after getting married. The rainy Saturday they spent assembling inexpensive furniture because they could not afford professional movers. The diner in Brooklyn, where they celebrated when his first investor agreed to fund Whitaker Medical Technologies. Ryan found himself remembering details he had not thought about in years. The waitress who always called them by name, the cracked leather booth near the window, Vanessa laughing because the coffee tasted terrible while insisting it was still the happiest meal she had ever shared with him. The memories arrived quietly, making no attempt to blame him. Somehow that made them impossible to ignore. Then the letter changed. 4 months earlier, you asked me when everything between us became so quiet. I almost answered honestly. I almost told you that silence rarely arrives all at once. It grows one postponed conversation at a time, until eventually, neither person remembers how to begin speaking again. Ryan lowered the pages for a moment. 4 months earlier, his thoughts drifted backward to late autumn, when life still looked ordinary from the outside. Whitaker Medical Technologies had been preparing for the largest acquisition in company history. Financial news channels discussed his expansion almost daily. Investors praised his discipline. Employees admired his leadership. Friends congratulated him for building the company faster than anyone had predicted. Yet somewhere beyond headlines and board meetings, another story had been unfolding inside his own home, without attracting anyone's attention, including his own. That November morning had begun like countless others. Ryan left the apartment before sunrise, carrying 2 phones, a laptop bag, and a breakfast he never planned to finish. Vanessa stood in the kitchen wearing Navy hospital scrubs, placing fresh coffee into his travel mug, exactly the way she always had. She smiled as he reached the front door. "Do you think you might be home for dinner tonight?" she asked gently. Ryan checked the time on his watch before answering. "Probably not. The acquisition team is flying in from Chicago. We will finish late." Vanessa nodded with quiet understanding. "All right, drive safely." Ryan kissed her forehead distractedly before leaving. He never noticed that she had prepared dinner ingredients before going to work that morning because she still believed there was a chance he might come home early. He also never realized that would become the last time she asked him to share an ordinary evening together. The memories refused to leave Ryan Whitaker alone. As the afternoon light slowly faded beyond the windows of his office, the letter remained open across his desk, drawing him further into a version of his own life that he had somehow overlooked while living it. Vanessa's handwriting remained steady across every page, free of bitterness and untouched by resentment. She never described a single dramatic argument because there had never been one. Instead, she wrote about the ordinary moments that quietly disappeared until there was nothing left holding 2 people together except habit. She reminded him of the Thanksgiving dinner she prepared for just the 2 of them after both of their families had traveled out of state. Ryan had promised he would arrive before 6 o'clock. The turkey rested in the oven. Candles had already been lit across the dining table. She waited until nearly 9 before placing everything into containers and quietly storing the untouched meal inside the refrigerator. The following morning, he apologized for working late and promised they would celebrate another weekend. Neither of them mentioned Thanksgiving again. Ryan remembered the evening immediately. At the time, he had viewed it as another unavoidable sacrifice required to build a successful company. Reading her words now, he realized she had experienced the same evening as another quiet confirmation that she was slowly disappearing from his priorities. The letter continued with remarkable honesty. "You often believed I stopped asking because I stopped caring. The truth is much simpler. I stopped asking because every unanswered hope eventually teaches a person to expect silence instead." Ryan closed his eyes for a moment as another memory surfaced. It had happened only weeks before she filed for divorce. Vanessa had walked into his home office, carrying 2 cups of coffee while he reviewed financial projections for the upcoming acquisition. She stood beside his desk for several seconds before speaking. "Do you have 10 minutes?" she had asked softly. Without looking away from his computer screen, Ryan answered automatically. "Can it wait until tomorrow? I need to send these reports before the market opens in London." Vanessa smiled politely, placed one cup beside his keyboard, and quietly left the room. He never asked what she wanted to discuss. Tomorrow became next week, and next week became another month. Sitting alone now, Ryan struggled to remember whether he had ever followed up on that conversation. He could not. The realization settled heavily over him. Success had trained him to solve complicated business problems within hours, yet he had somehow ignored the simplest question his wife ever asked. As evening settled across Manhattan, Ryan reached the final page inside the envelope. A smaller sealed packet slipped onto his desk, along with several neatly organized documents. Attached to the packet was another handwritten note. "I knew you would probably read the letter first. These papers explain everything else. I waited until after the divorce because I never wanted you to wonder whether I shared them to change your decision. Whatever happens after today belongs entirely to your own heart." Ryan stared at the unopened packet before carefully removing the seal. Inside rested medical records, bank statements, canceled checks, and several folded receipts arranged in chronological order. Confused, he unfolded the first document. Within seconds, his breathing slowed. The date printed across the top matched the exact week his mother had undergone emergency cardiac surgery nearly 2 years earlier. Until this moment, Ryan had always believed the enormous hospital bill had been quietly covered by his company's executive insurance policy. The signature at the bottom of the payment authorization told an entirely different story. Ryan Whitaker read the signature 3 times before accepting that it was real. Vanessa Brooks. The payment authorization had been approved from her personal savings account, not from Whitaker Medical Technologies, not from his executive insurance policy, and not from any charitable foundation. The amount covered the balance his mother's emergency insurance had refused to pay after unexpected complications extended her recovery. Ryan remembered the relief he had felt when the hospital administrator assured him that the financial issue had already been resolved. He had thanked his chief financial officer for handling everything so efficiently. The chief financial officer, it seemed, had never been involved at all. Ryan reached for the next document with unsteady hands. It was a series of canceled checks written over 18 months, each one directed toward the assisted living community where his mother now lived comfortably. Every payment had been made quietly on the first business day of each month. Attached to the final receipt was another handwritten note from Vanessa. "Your mother never wanted you distracted while you were building your company. She believed you carried enough responsibility already. I agreed with her. She asked me not to tell you because she wanted you to remember her as independent, not as someone who needed rescuing." Ryan leaned back in his chair, unable to look away from the pages spread across his desk. His mother had never once mentioned financial difficulties. Neither had Vanessa. Together they had protected his peace, while he believed he was protecting theirs. He opened another folder and discovered copies of correspondence from nearly 2 years earlier. During one of the most difficult quarters in company history, when an unexpected regulatory delay had threatened a major contract, Vanessa had quietly arranged introductions between Whitaker Medical Technologies and several nonprofit pediatric hospitals where she had built trusted professional relationships through years of medical service. Those introductions eventually developed into partnerships that strengthened the company's reputation and opened opportunities Ryan proudly described during shareholder meetings. He had always credited his executive team for the breakthrough. Now he realized the first door had been opened by someone who had never asked for recognition. The final sheet inside the folder was not a financial record at all. It was a simple photograph. Ryan stared at it for several silent moments. The picture had been taken outside his mother's rehabilitation center shortly after her surgery. Margaret Whitaker sat smiling beneath a flowering dogwood tree while Vanessa knelt beside her, both women laughing at something outside the camera's view. Ryan searched his memory desperately, trying to remember where he had been that afternoon. Then it came back to him. He had been delivering a keynote presentation at an international healthcare conference in Boston, convinced that missing one family visit was an acceptable sacrifice for the future of his company. His mother had never complained. Vanessa had never mentioned making the 3-hour drive alone to spend the day with her. A quiet knock interrupted the silence. Daniel Hayes stepped into the office, carrying several legal folders before immediately noticing the documents covering Ryan's desk. "I did not realize she finally gave them to you," he said carefully. Ryan slowly looked up. "You knew about this?" Daniel hesitated before answering. "Not everything. Only enough to understand why she insisted the envelope could not be opened until the divorce became official." Ryan lowered his eyes again, overwhelmed by a question that refused to leave him. If these were only the documents Vanessa believed he deserved to know, what had she carried in silence that no piece of paper could ever fully explain? Ryan Whitaker did not leave his office until long after the lights across Midtown had begun disappearing one floor at a time. The folders Vanessa Brooks had left behind remained spread across his conference table exactly where he had placed them, as though moving them would somehow make the truth less real. Before driving home, he made one decision that would have seemed impossible only that morning. He called his assistant and canceled every meeting scheduled for the following day. "Reschedule whatever can wait," he said quietly. "I have something more important to understand." Early the next morning, Ryan drove to the assisted living community where his mother, Margaret Whitaker, had lived for the past 2 years. The familiar receptionist greeted him warmly before escorting him toward the garden, where Margaret often spent her mornings reading beneath a large maple tree. She smiled the moment she saw her son, but the smile faded slightly after noticing the thick envelope tucked beneath his arm. "She finally gave them to you," Margaret said softly, before Ryan had spoken a single word. Ryan sat beside her in silence for several moments. "Why did nobody tell me?" he finally asked. Margaret closed the book resting on her lap and looked toward the flower beds surrounding the walking path. "Because every time I tried, Vanessa stopped me." Ryan frowned in confusion. "Why?" Margaret smiled gently. "Because she knew exactly how hard you were working. She believed you carried enough pressure already. She kept saying there would be time to explain everything once your company found stable ground." Ryan lowered his eyes. "The company became stable years ago." Margaret nodded sadly. "Yes, but by then the two of you had already stopped talking about anything that truly mattered." Her words settled heavily between them. Ryan thought back to countless evenings spent answering electronic mail during dinner, taking conference calls while Vanessa quietly cleaned the kitchen alone, promising vacations that were postponed until they quietly disappeared from the calendar altogether. None of those moments had seemed important individually. Together they had become the distance neither of them knew how to cross. "She visited every Saturday," Margaret continued. "Sometimes after working 12-hour shifts at the children's hospital, she would bring groceries, help organize my medications, and stay until I finished telling the same old stories you heard growing up." Ryan looked up slowly. "Every Saturday?" Margaret smiled. "Almost never missed one." Ryan searched his memory. Saturday had always been his busiest day for investor meetings, industry conferences, or travel. He had assumed his mother preferred quiet weekends alone. The realization left him speechless. Before leaving, Margaret reached into her knitting basket and handed him a small envelope whose edges had softened with time. "Vanessa asked me to keep this in case you ever started asking the right questions," she said. "I think today is that day." Ryan waited until he reached his car before opening it. Inside was a folded thank you card from nearly 3 years earlier, written by the director of a pediatric hospital where Vanessa volunteered. The note thanked Whitaker Medical Technologies for anonymously donating advanced medical equipment to children who otherwise could not afford treatment. Ryan stared at the company letterhead printed across the donation receipt. He remembered approving that charitable contribution during a quarterly finance review, believing it had been recommended by his public relations department as part of a corporate branding initiative. Attached to the receipt was one final handwritten sentence from Vanessa. "I changed the destination after learning where the children needed it most. I always hoped one day you would discover that the greatest return on any investment cannot be measured on a balance sheet." Ryan folded the paper carefully and looked through the windshield as families walked together beneath the autumn trees. For the first time in years, he realized that the fortune he had spent a lifetime building had never been the richest thing in his life. The richest part had quietly stood beside him all along, asking for nothing except the time he never believed he could spare. Ryan Whitaker spent the next 2 days chasing pieces of a life he had never realized existed beside his own. Every answer he uncovered led to another question, and every question revealed how completely success had narrowed his vision. The executives who admired his discipline had never seen the quiet sacrifices waiting for him at home. The investors who praised his judgment had never known that some of his company's most meaningful achievements had begun with ideas that never carried his name. Late Wednesday morning, Ryan drove to the Children's Hospital where Vanessa Brooks had worked for nearly a decade. He did not arrive as the founder of Whitaker Medical Technologies, or as a generous donor whose photograph occasionally appeared in annual reports. He arrived simply as a man trying to understand the person he had once promised to love for the rest of his life. Grace Coleman, Vanessa's longtime friend and fellow pediatric physician, greeted him politely inside the hospital cafeteria. She had known Ryan for years, yet there was a careful distance in her expression that had never existed before. "Thank you for agreeing to meet me," Ryan said sincerely. Grace stirred her coffee before answering. "Vanessa would not want me to speak badly about you." Ryan lowered his eyes. "Then tell me something true instead." Grace remained quiet for several seconds. "The truth is that she never stopped believing you were a good man," she said softly. "She only stopped believing your schedule would ever make room for your marriage." Ryan absorbed the words without defending himself. Grace continued, her voice calm rather than accusatory. "Do you remember the year your company almost lost the federal compliance contract?" Ryan nodded immediately. "That crisis had nearly cost hundreds of employees their jobs. Vanessa spent weeks introducing your leadership team to pediatric administrators across the state because she believed those partnerships could strengthen your credibility. She never asked for recognition because she assumed one day you would simply notice." Ryan closed his eyes briefly. He remembered celebrating when the contracts were approved, thanking board members, consultants, and investors during a company banquet. He had never thanked the woman sitting beside him that evening because he had never known she deserved it. Grace reached into her handbag and placed a folded newspaper clipping on the table. The article featured Whitaker Medical Technologies receiving a statewide award for community healthcare innovation nearly 18 months earlier. A photograph showed Ryan accepting the honor while smiling confidently beneath bright stage lights. Grace quietly pointed toward the audience captured in the background. Several rows behind the executives sat Vanessa, applauding with genuine pride while still wearing the Navy hospital scrubs she had come to the ceremony in after finishing a 12-hour shift. She almost missed the event because one of her young patients needed unexpected surgery, Grace said. She still came because she wanted to see you succeed. Ryan stared at the faded photograph longer than he expected. He could not remember seeing Vanessa in the audience that evening. He had been too focused on the cameras, the speeches, and the future he believed he was building for both of them. As he prepared to leave, Grace offered one final thought. "You keep asking what ended your marriage," she said gently. "It was never one terrible decision. It was thousands of ordinary moments when work always arrived first and love quietly learned to wait." Ryan thanked her before walking slowly through the hospital corridor. Children's laughter echoed from the rehabilitation wing, while parents waited patiently outside examination rooms, grateful simply to spend another ordinary day together. Standing there, Ryan finally understood something no business book had ever taught him. Extraordinary success meant very little if it constantly demanded the sacrifice of the ordinary moments that gave success its meaning. He reached for his phone, hesitated, and then searched for Vanessa's number, uncertain whether she would answer, but knowing that for the first time in years, he was no longer calling because he expected something from her. He was calling because she deserved to hear the apology he should have spoken long before either of them signed a single piece of paper. The call rang 4 times before Ryan Whitaker heard the quiet click on the other end of the line. For a brief moment, neither of them spoke. The silence carried none of the awkwardness that had once filled their home. Instead, it felt like two strangers carefully deciding how to begin a conversation that should have happened years earlier. "Hello, Ryan," Vanessa Brooks said gently. Her voice sounded exactly as he remembered, calm, steady, and unexpectedly comforting. Ryan closed his eyes for a moment before answering. "Thank you for picking up." Vanessa smiled softly, though he could not see it. You sounded like someone who was calling for a reason. Ryan looked through the windows of his office toward the fading Manhattan skyline. For the first time in his professional life, the right words did not arrive easily. I finished reading everything, he finally admitted. I should have known. I should have asked. I should have been paying attention. There was no immediate reply. When Vanessa finally spoke, her voice carried neither satisfaction nor disappointment. You know now. Ryan took a slow breath. May I see you? I am not asking you to change anything. I only want the chance to apologize face to face. Vanessa remained quiet long enough for Ryan to wonder whether the conversation had already ended. Then she answered with the same kindness that had always defined her. There is a community health fair at Riverside Children's Center tomorrow afternoon. I will be there until 4 o'clock. If you still want to talk after seeing the work we are doing, you are welcome to stop by. The next afternoon, Ryan arrived several minutes early. The renovated community center stood in a neighborhood he had driven past countless times without ever noticing. Children filled the playground while volunteer physicians, nurses, and medical students welcomed families into temporary examination rooms offering free health screenings. There were no television cameras, no corporate banners, and no reporters documenting charitable efforts. Everyone present had come simply because they believed the work mattered. Ryan spotted Vanessa near a registration table helping an elderly grandmother complete medical forms while patiently answering questions from worried parents waiting nearby. She moved through the crowded hallway with quiet confidence, greeting every volunteer by name and kneeling to speak gently with frightened children so they would not feel intimidated by white examination coats or unfamiliar equipment. Ryan stood at a respectful distance, watching something he had never truly taken the time to see during their marriage. Vanessa had always possessed this extraordinary ability to make every person before her feel like the most important individual in the room. Nearly an hour passed before their eyes finally met. Vanessa excused herself politely and walked toward him with the same composed expression she had carried into the attorney's office only days earlier. "Thank you for coming," she said. Ryan looked around the busy community center before answering. "I almost forgot what your world looked like." Vanessa followed his gaze toward the families filling the waiting area. "This has always been my world." Ryan nodded slowly. "I know that now." They found 2 empty chairs beneath a shaded courtyard overlooking a small playground where children laughed together beneath bright spring sunshine. Ryan folded his hands together before speaking. "I owe you more apologies than one conversation can possibly hold." Vanessa listened quietly. "Then start with the one that matters most." Ryan lowered his eyes. "I spent years believing I was building a better future for us. The truth is that I was building it alone, because I stopped asking whether you still wanted the same future I imagined." Vanessa looked at him thoughtfully before responding. "You were never a cruel husband, Ryan. You were simply absent while standing beside me." Her words carried no anger, only honesty. Somehow that honesty hurt more than blame ever could. Ryan realized there was nothing he could say to erase the years already behind them. The only thing left within his control was the kind of man he chose to become after finally understanding what he had lost. The conversation beneath the courtyard trees stayed with Ryan Whitaker long after he left the community health center that afternoon. Vanessa Brooks had offered him neither false hope nor unnecessary distance. She had simply spoken the truth with the quiet grace that had always defined her. During the drive back to Manhattan, he found himself replaying one sentence over and over again. "You were simply absent while standing beside me." It was the kind of truth that could not be argued with because it demanded no defense, only reflection. The following Monday, Ryan walked into the executive boardroom, carrying a folder instead of his usual presentation tablet. The directors expected another discussion about quarterly growth projections, international expansion, and shareholder expectations. Instead, Ryan surprised everyone by postponing the acquisition they had spent nearly a year negotiating. "There is a different investment I want this company to make first," he said calmly. Several executives exchanged puzzled glances. Ryan continued. "Beginning next quarter, Whitaker Medical Technologies will establish permanent partnerships with community pediatric clinics across the state. We will provide equipment, scholarships, and volunteer support where access to healthcare remains limited." One director immediately questioned the financial return. Ryan answered without hesitation. Not every meaningful decision belongs on a profit forecast. The room fell silent. Those who had worked beside him for years sensed that something fundamental had changed. Later that week, Ryan personally visited several of the clinics Vanessa had quietly supported throughout her career. He never announced his arrival in advance. He did not invite photographers or marketing teams. He simply listened. Physicians described overcrowded waiting rooms. Nurses explained how outdated equipment delayed diagnoses. Parents spoke about driving hours for specialist appointments because their neighborhoods lacked basic medical resources. Ryan realized that everything Vanessa had tried to show him during their marriage had always existed in plain sight. He had simply been looking in another direction. Several days later, he returned to Riverside Children's Center carrying a proposal he had written himself. Vanessa welcomed him politely after finishing appointments with her last patients. "I hope this is not another apology," she said with a gentle smile. Ryan shook his head. "No, this is a promise to myself." He handed her the folder. Inside were detailed plans for a long-term partnership between Whitaker Medical Technologies and independent children's health programs throughout New York, designed without naming him after any building, scholarship, or foundation. Vanessa carefully reviewed several pages before looking up. "You removed your company's branding requirements," she observed. Ryan nodded. "Because the children receiving care do not need to remember my name. They only need the care itself." Vanessa smiled with quiet approval. "That sounds like someone who finally understands why I became a doctor." Ryan returned her smile, not expecting praise, only grateful that she recognized the sincerity behind his decision. Before leaving, he paused beside the entrance. "I know there is no path back to the marriage we once had," he said honestly. "I am no longer trying to rebuild yesterday. I am trying to become someone who deserves tomorrow, whatever that looks like." Vanessa stepped forward and gently extended her hand. Ryan accepted it, surprised by how meaningful such a simple gesture could feel. "Then keep going," she said softly. "The best apologies are not spoken once. They are lived every day." As Ryan walked toward his car beneath the fading evening light, he understood that forgiveness was not a destination someone else handed to him. It was a responsibility he earned through the choices he made after the apology ended, and for the first time in many years, he felt that his life was finally moving in the right direction, even if it was no longer the direction he had originally planned. 1 year passed with the quiet determination of seasons changing without asking anyone for permission. Spring returned to New York carrying the familiar scent of flowering trees through city parks, while neighborhoods once forgotten now welcomed families into newly renovated pediatric clinics, supported by partnerships that had grown from a single decision made without expecting recognition. Whitaker Medical Technologies had become known for something far greater than quarterly earnings. Across the company, employees volunteered in schools, community centers, and children's hospitals, not because a marketing department instructed them to, but because their leadership had finally learned that lasting success was measured by lives improved rather than headlines collected. Ryan Whitaker no longer appeared on every magazine cover that requested an interview. He accepted fewer speaking engagements, spent more weekends visiting community projects, and discovered that conversations with nurses, teachers, parents, and young patients often taught him more than meetings with investors ever had. He had not rebuilt the marriage he once lost, but he had rebuilt the character that marriage had quietly asked him to become all along. Vanessa Brooks continued serving children with the same steady compassion that had defined her long before anyone noticed. Her work expanding community healthcare programs reached families throughout New York, inspiring hospitals and nonprofit organizations to collaborate in ways few had imagined possible only a year earlier. On a bright afternoon in early May, the American Pediatric Health Foundation hosted its annual awards ceremony inside a historic theater overlooking the Hudson River. Physicians, researchers, volunteers, and civic leaders filled the auditorium to celebrate individuals whose work had transformed healthcare beyond hospital walls. When Vanessa's name was announced as the recipient of the foundation's highest humanitarian honor, the audience rose together in a standing ovation that continued far longer than expected. She walked to the stage wearing a simple navy dress, smiling with the same quiet humility that had accompanied every meaningful achievement throughout her life. Her acceptance speech lasted less than 5 minutes. She thanked her colleagues, her patients, every volunteer who believed ordinary kindness could change extraordinary circumstances, and every family who had trusted them during difficult moments. She never mentioned the sacrifices that had brought her there. She never spoke about the marriage that had ended. She simply honored the future rather than revisiting the past. Sitting near the back of the auditorium, Ryan applauded with everyone else. There were no reserved seats bearing his name, no special introductions, and no expectation that anyone would notice his presence. He had come for only one reason. He wanted to witness the moment someone he deeply respected received recognition she had earned many years before the world finally caught up. After the ceremony ended, guests slowly gathered in the theater lobby beneath tall windows overlooking the river. Ryan waited patiently until the crowd around Vanessa had grown smaller before walking toward her. She greeted him with a warm smile that reflected peace rather than unfinished history. "Congratulations," he said sincerely. "This honor should have found you a long time ago." Vanessa thanked him softly. For a moment they simply stood together watching the evening sunlight shimmer across the water beyond the glass. Ryan reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and removed the same white envelope that had changed his life. The edges had softened from being carried for an entire year. "I keep it with me," he admitted, "not because I enjoy remembering my mistakes, but because it reminds me never to overlook the people standing beside me again." Vanessa looked at the envelope before meeting his eyes. Then it served its purpose. Ryan smiled gently. "It did much more than that. It gave me back the man I should have been long before I signed those papers." They shook hands one final time, not as former husband and wife searching for another beginning, but as two people whose lives had forever shaped one another for the better. As Vanessa walked toward the future she had built, with patience and dignity, Ryan remained by the window for a quiet moment, grateful that although love had not rewritten their ending, truth had rewritten his life, and he finally understood that the greatest victories are not won by holding on to the people we love, but by becoming worthy of the lessons they leave behind.